The lawyer's office smelled of old leather and dust, the perfume of secrets kept in filing cabinets for decades. Isolde Ashworth sat rigid in the mahogany chair, her black funeral dress still pressed from yesterday's burial, the fabric whispering softly whenever she shifted. Her mother's solicitor, Mr. Henley, slid a brass key across the desk, with the solemnity of a priest administering last rites. "Thornwick Manor," he said quietly. "Your mother inherited it from her mother, who inherited it from hers. There are conditions attached." Isolde's throat tightened. Her mother had been dead for 3 days. A stroke, sudden and merciless, while Isolde was at university in London, 3 hours away. She'd spent the last 72 hours in a fog of arrangements and phone calls, moving through the rituals of death like an automaton. The manor was news to her, genuinely news. Her mother had lived in a modest cottage in Surrey, worked as a librarian, had kept almost nothing from her own mother's estate. Conditions? Isolde's voice came out smaller than she intended. Henley adjusted his spectacles. He was ancient himself, probably in his 80s, with liver spots on his hands and sad, knowing eyes. "The manor is yours to inhabit, but it must remain occupied. At least 3 months of every year, Miss Ashworth. If the conditions are violated, the property reverts to the National Trust." "Why would anyone want?" Isolde began. But Henley was already standing, moving toward a filing cabinet. He withdrew a leather portfolio, yellowed with age. "Your mother left instructions. She said you would inherit on her death, and that you would need to read her journals before entering the manor." He placed the portfolio in Isolde's trembling hands. She was quite adamant about this. Isolde drove north that evening, the key heavy in her coat pocket, the journals sealed in her overnight bag like contraband. The motorway dissolved into rural roads, and by the time she reached the village of Thornwick, darkness had swallowed the landscape. The sat-nav guided her down a long drive lined with skeletal oaks, their branches clawing at the twilight. Thornwick Manor emerged like a ghost. It was enormous, a Victorian Gothic construction of grey stone and pointed arches, turrets spiraling into the indigo sky, gargoyles perched on the corners, windows like dead eyes. Isolde's hands shook as she fumbled the key into the lock, and when the door swung open, the smell that greeted her was ancient: stone, mildew, and something else. Something like old perfume, or old blood, though she had no reference for how blood smelled. She found the light switches, and the manor gasped awake around her, chandeliers crackling to life, electricity humming through walls that hadn't heard it in years. The foyer was vast, all marble and gilt mirrors, with a grand staircase dividing the space like a spine. Portraits lined the walls, stern-faced ancestors in oils and gilt frames. Their eyes followed her as she climbed toward the second floor. Her mother's journals were waiting to be read, but Isolde found herself drawn upward instead, deeper into the manor's heart. Guided by what instinct? Compulsion. She climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs to a corridor she instinctively knew was the eastern wing. The air grew colder. Dust motes hung suspended in the darkness like drowned things. At the end of the hallway stood a single door. Inside was a portrait gallery. Isolde's breath caught. The paintings were exquisite masterworks of Victorian portraiture, each one depicting a different man, each spanning centuries of clothing styles and artistic technique. The frames were ornate silver, each one engraved with a date. The earliest read 1742, but it was the final portrait that stopped her cold. He was rendered in moonlight and shadow, a man of perhaps 30 years, with dark eyes that seemed to contain centuries. He wore black velvet and silver chains. His skin was pale as marble, and there was something in his expression, a mingling of hunger and sorrow so profound that Isolde felt it like a physical touch. The frame was engraved, Cassius Ven, Anno Domini, 1847. The painting was so alive that she could have sworn she saw his eyes move. A trick of the candlelight, she'd brought a candle, not daring to turn on electric lights in this room, but the effect was hypnotic. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out as though to touch the canvas. The moment her fingers grazed the frame, the portrait's eyes shifted. Isolde jerked backward, gasping. The man in the painting was now looking directly at her, and his mouth had curved into something between a smile and a snarl, exposing canines that were far too long, too sharp, too hungry. His hand was raised, palm outward, as though he could reach through the varnish and canvas to touch her. She ran. Down the narrow stairs, her feet skidding on ancient carpet, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through bone. She ran until she reached the foyer, until she collapsed into an armchair near the dying fire, gasping like she'd been drowning. It was a trick. candlelight playing against varnished paint, her grief and exhaustion manifesting as paranoia. Isolde forced herself to breathe, forced herself to be rational. She was 23 years old, educated, modern. She did not believe in paintings that moved, but she did not climb the stairs again that night. Instead, she opened her mother's journals by the fire's guttering light and began to read the words her mother had been waiting for her to find. My dearest Isolde, by the time you read this, I am gone, and Thornwick Manor is yours. I know this will be a shock. I have kept secrets from you, terrible, necessary secrets, and now you must know the truth about our bloodline, about why the manor must never stand empty, about why, no matter how strange it seems, you must never, under any circumstances, lock the doors at midnight. Our family does not simply descend from aristocracy. We descend from something older, something darker. We are bound to him, to the manor, to the curse that has shaped our family for nearly 300 years. When you are ready to understand, the answers are in the Eastern Gallery. But Isolde, my darling girl, you must be careful. He has been alone so very long, and loneliness is a hunger far more terrible than any blood could ever be. The portrait will tell you the rest. Forgive me for leaving you to this. Forgive him for what he is, Mother. Outside, midnight had fallen, and somewhere in the manor, in the walls, in the stone, in the very air itself, Isolde heard the sound of footsteps descending a staircase that couldn't possibly exist. They were coming toward her. The footsteps stopped. Isolde's breath came in shallow gasps. Her mother's journal clutched against her chest like a talisman. The foyer was silent, except for the pop and hiss of dying embers in the fireplace. Minutes stretched like rubber. She waited for the footsteps to resume, for a shadow to emerge from the darkness beyond the candlelit radius, for something to materialize that would confirm she was losing her mind. Nothing came. At some point near 2 a.m, exhaustion overtook terror. Isolde dragged herself upstairs to the main bedroom, a vast chamber with a 4-poster bed and velvet curtains so heavy they seemed to absorb light. She locked the door, wedged a chair beneath the handle, drew the curtains so tightly that not even moonlight could penetrate, though she could feel the moon's presence beyond the fabric, full and swollen and watching. She didn't sleep. Instead, she read her mother's journals by lamplight, and with each page, the world she thought she understood crumbled into something far stranger and more terrible. The earliest entry was dated March 1992, written in her mother's younger hand. I met him today in the manor library. I wasn't supposed to go to the Eastern Wing. Grandmother had been explicit about that, but I was searching for a book on medieval history, and there he was, reading by candlelight as though the electric lamps didn't exist, as though the last 100 years hadn't happened at all. He didn't look at me at first. He simply turned a page in his book and said, "Your grandmother warned you about this wing, didn't she?" His voice was like old wine, like something that had been aging in the dark for centuries. I couldn't lie to him. It was impossible to lie. The truth just spilled out of me like blood from a wound. He finally looked at me, and I understood why grandmother was afraid. The entries continued chronologically, documenting a slow descent or ascent, depending on perspective, into something that might have been love, or might have been something far more predatory. Isolde's mother had been young, lonely, intellectually restless. The vampire, because there was no other word for what Cassius was. The journals made that abundantly clear, had been isolated in the manor for centuries, bound by an ancient curse that prevented him from leaving the property. He told me tonight about the curse. It was laid upon him in 1847, by a woman he refused to damn to immortality. She died of old age while he remained, unchanging, a living punishment for his refusal to damn her. The witch who cursed him said he would be bound to whoever inherited the manor from his bloodline, bound to protect them, bound to hunger for them, bound to remain trapped within these walls forever. The cruelest imprisonment. Not chains but solitude. Not death but eternal life unlived. He told me I was the first of the bloodline he'd seen in 40 years. The previous owner, a distant cousin, had broken the tradition. Didn't live here. Let the manor fall into disrepair. And Cassius waited in the dark, growing weaker, lonelier, more hungry with each passing season. I've started leaving candles lit in the library. I tell myself it's because the electric lights are harsh. I don't admit that it's because he prefers them. That candlelight makes him seem less like a predator and more like a man. Isolde set the journal down, her hands trembling. She understood now why her mother had kept Thornwick Manor, why she'd maintained the tradition of occupation. It was an obligation. It was obligation born from something deeper, from blood, quite literally. She was descended from Cassius's line. The journals made that clear. Her mother's grandmother, Isolde's great-great-grandmother, had been his lover, pregnant with his heir, and when she died in childbirth, he had broken down the barriers of his curse enough to create a bloodline that could inherit the manor, ensuring that someone of his blood would always return, that he would never be entirely alone again. It was beautiful and terrible. It was love corrupted into contractual obligation. Around 4 a.m, Isolde felt it a pull, like a thread tied around her spine, drawing her toward the eastern wing. It wasn't irresistible, not quite, but it was insistent. She found herself rising from the bed despite her intention to remain locked away, her feet moving toward the door despite the chair wedged beneath the handle. She didn't move the chair. Instead, she stood at the locked door and pressed her forehead against the wood, resisting. Her mother's final words echoed. He has been alone so very long, and loneliness is a hunger far more terrible than any blood could ever be. I can't, Isolde whispered to the darkness. I can't go to you. I don't know you. The pull intensified. She felt it in her teeth, in her bones, in the deepest chambers of her heart, and underneath it, she sensed something else, not a voice, but a presence, vast and sorrowful and desperate. It was like touching a wound that had been bleeding for centuries, unable to close, unable to heal. Please, the presence seemed to say without words, please don't lock me out again. Isolde slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor, her back against the wood, separated from the hallway by only a few inches of oak. She could feel him on the other side, not physically, but in some deeper way, as though her bloodline was a tuning fork resonating at a frequency only he could produce. Tell me, she said to the darkness. Tell me something true. There was a long silence. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, she heard his voice not in the hallway, but in her mind, like a memory of a voice she'd never heard, but always known. Your mother loved the roses in the garden. She used to pick them at dusk and leave them in vases throughout the manor. Red ones, always red. She said the color reminded her that I was still alive, even if I no longer bled. Isolde felt tears on her cheeks. Her mother had never mentioned roses, had never mentioned the manor at all in conversation, but the detail was so specific, so achingly tender, that she knew it was true. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you need to know that I am not a monster. Not entirely. Because you are here now, and your presence is both the sweetest relief and the sharpest torture I have known. Because in a few hours, the sun will rise, and I will be forced to retreat into the shadows, and I cannot bear another day of solitude, Isolde Ashworth. I cannot. The pull intensified, becoming almost painful. She gripped the doorframe to keep herself from standing, from moving, from surrendering to whatever gravity was drawing her toward him. It's not dawn yet, she said firmly, to herself as much as to him. And I'm not moving. She heard something, then a sound like a wounded animal, like centuries of loneliness crystallizing into a single moment of despair. Then the presence withdrew, sliding back through the manor like a tide retreating from shore. But it didn't disappear entirely. It remained at the edges of her awareness, waiting, watching, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the particular torment of being known by someone you've just met, of being recognized by a stranger who has been waiting for you for 300 years. Isolde remained on the floor until dawn broke gray and reluctant across the windows, finally releasing her from the pull. She did not go to the eastern wing, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would. Daylight should have brought clarity. Instead, it brought questions that multiplied like shadows at dusk. Isolde spent the morning moving through Thornwick Manor like a ghost haunting her own inheritance, running her fingers along dust-covered furniture and reading the spines of books in the library. Her mother's journals lay open on the mahogany desk, pages marked with loose photographs, candid shots of her mother in gardens, on the manor's stone steps, always alone, always with that particular sadness in her eyes that Isolde now understood. By noon, hunger forced her to venture to the kitchen. The pantry was stocked with surprising abundance, tinned goods, dried pasta, fresh vegetables in the cellar, impossibly fresh, as though someone had been tending them. The refrigerator hummed with modern efficiency, and she realized that the manor's utilities weren't abandoned, they were maintained. By whom? She didn't ask. The answer felt too obvious. She made tea with trembling hands and sat at the kitchen table, watching the clock inch toward evening. The pull had returned around midday, gentler than before but persistent, a constant awareness of his presence, like standing near a sleeping predator. She could almost map his location by the intensity of it. He was somewhere in the western wing, in the older part of the manor, where Victorian architecture gave way to Tudor stonework, and the windows were narrower, designed to block out light rather than welcome it. At 4 o'clock, Isolde made a decision. She dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but out of armor. Black trousers, a cream silk blouse, her mother's pearl necklace. For luck, for protection, for connection to something solid and real. She braided her dark hair tightly, needing to feel contained. Then she climbed to the eastern wing. The portrait gallery seemed different in daylight, less sinister, though no less strange. The paintings of the previous Cassius, she didn't know the plural, stared down at her with their various expressions of noble suffering, but she didn't stop to examine them. Instead, she continued past the gallery, toward a corridor she instinctively knew led deeper, toward the heart of his domain. The light grew dimmer. Chandeliers gave way to candelabras, and candelabras gave way to single tapered candles and sconces. The air temperature dropped with each step, and she could smell it now, the scent her mind had tried to rationalize the previous night. It was like incense and rust and something floral, something like night-blooming jasmine mixed with the sharp copper tang of iron. The corridor opened into a library, but not the library her mother had written about. This was something else entirely, a chamber that seemed to have been carved from the manor itself, with shelves cut directly into the stone walls, rising 20 feet to a vaulted ceiling. Candlelight flickered across thousands of spines. Leather-bound volumes, ancient manuscripts, first editions of works that shouldn't have existed outside of museums. The sheer wealth of knowledge pressed down on her like physical weight. He was standing at a window, the only window in the room, gazing out at the grounds below. Even in stillness, he was inhumanly graceful, his posture perfect, his shoulders broad beneath a black cashmere sweater that looked aggressively modern. His hair was dark, nearly black, and it caught the pale afternoon light like obsidian. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders tensed infinitesimally. "You came," he said. His voice was exactly as the journals had described. Old wine, aged wood, something timeless and dangerous. "I wasn't certain you would." "Neither was I," Isolde admitted. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I'm not sure this is wise." Now he turned, and the portrait had not lied. His eyes held centuries, but they also held something raw, longing so acute it bordered on pain. He studied her with an intensity that felt like it was stripping away layers, reading the architecture of her soul the way he might read one of his ancient books. "Your mother was wise," he said quietly. "She always maintained distance, kept the walls between us carefully constructed. She understood the danger." "And what danger is that?" Isolde's voice came out steadier than she felt. "That you'll hurt me? That you'll infect me with your curse?" A shadow crossed his face, something like regret, something like hunger. "That I'll make you complicit in your own damnation. That proximity to me becomes a kind of seduction, a slow erosion of the boundaries that keep you human." He moved toward the window again, turning his back to her. The gesture was deliberate. She understood it as an offer. He was removing himself from her line of sight, making himself less threatening, less present. It was considerate, and that made it worse somehow. She'd prepared herself for a monster. A monster would have been simpler. "My mother came here," Isolde said, "night after night, and she survived." "Yes." His voice carried a weight of meaning. "She survived. She also wept in the gardens. She also wrote in her journals about the temptation of the bite, of the seduction of immortality. She also made peace with the fact that I would never ask her to cross that threshold, because asking would be a betrayal of the one thing that made her worth knowing." He turned back to her, and in the candlelight, she saw his canines clearly not as grotesque as she'd feared, but as something almost elegant, an evolutionary mutation, nothing more, and yet everything. She understood, he continued, that love without corruption is the only kind of love worth having, and that to damn someone you love is to prove you've never loved them at all. Isolde found herself moving toward him, not compelled by the pull that was still there, at the edges of her awareness, but by something more dangerous: curiosity, understanding, the terrible recognition that this ancient creature standing before her had been shaped by loneliness into something almost human. "What are you?" she asked. "I am Cassius Venn," he said. "Once Prince of Carpathia, once lover, soldier, believer. Now," he gestured at the vast library surrounding them, "now I am books and memory and the endless hunger of immortality. I am the curse made manifest. I am very, very alone." He raised his hand, not threatening, but offering. "May I?" Isolde understood what he was asking. permission to touch her. She stepped closer and extended her own hand. When their fingers met, it was like touching electricity made flesh, cold and alive simultaneously. She felt the shock of his undeath through her entire nervous system, and underneath it, she felt something else. A pressure against the boundaries of her mind. A presence so vast and ancient that it threatened to overwhelm her completely. She gasped and tried to pull away, but his grip was gentle, non-coercive. He simply held her palm against his, and she could feel his pulse slow, deliberate, the thrum of blood that moved through his veins like wine through a decanter. 300 years, he whispered. 300 years since someone of my own blood touched me with recognition instead of fear. Isolde felt something crack open in her chest, not surrender, but empathy. Raw, dangerous empathy for a creature that should have terrified her. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, she said. Neither do I, Cassius replied. That is what makes this so exquisitely terrible. Outside, the sun was descending toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. And Isolde remained in the candlelit library, hand in hand with an immortal curse, understanding with crystal clarity that her life had just divided itself into before and after. There would be no going back. The next 3 days blurred together like watercolor bleeding into wet canvas. Isolde found herself drawn to the library as dusk descended each evening, drawn by the pull that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Cassius never demanded her presence. The pull seemed to emanate from him unconsciously, a gravitational force he couldn't suppress any more than the Earth could suppress its orbit around the sun. But each night, when she climbed the stairs to the eastern wing, he was waiting. They talked. God, how they talked. Cassius spoke of the Carpathian Empire, of courts and crowns, of a sister he'd loved and a lover he'd refused to damn. He spoke in 4 languages, sometimes mid-sentence shifting from English to Romanian to French to Latin, and Isolde found herself understanding the untranslatable words through context and blood memory, because that's what it was. She realized, a form of understanding that bypassed her rational mind and spoke directly to the marrow of her bones. He showed her his library. Not just the main chamber, but the hidden rooms beyond a vault containing medieval manuscripts, first editions of grimoires, letters written in hands long turned to dust. He showed her a journal bound in leather that was older than the United States, open to a passage written in 1623. The hunger is not for blood. Blood is merely the vehicle. What I crave is connection, the dissolution of the boundary between self and other. In feeding, I briefly become human again. I feel another's heartbeat as my own, taste their memories, know them in the way God must know his creation. Is that why you need us? Isolde asked. They were sitting in the library's inner chamber, surrounded by candlelight and centuries of accumulated sorrow. The bloodline, the inheritance, to feed? No. His voice was sharp, almost angry. I have survived 300 years without feeding on my own line. The hunters in the village provide sustenance when necessary. The pull you feel has nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with, he paused, struggling, with recognition. Blood calls to blood. You are the closest thing to family I have known since my sister died in 1851. Isolde absorbed this. My mother knew that. Yes, and it tortured her, because she also felt what you're beginning to feel now, the attraction that exists alongside the familial bond, the corruption of bloodline into something else entirely. On the 4th evening, it happened. Isolde had been exploring the Manor's east tower, a spiraling staircase that led to rooms she suspected no one had entered in decades. In one of the upper chambers, she found an old music box, porcelain and silver, depicting a ballroom scene. When she wound it, it played a waltz in minor key, haunting and impossibly sad. She was so absorbed in the melody that she didn't notice the torn wallpaper until she'd already cut her hand on an exposed nail. Blood welled immediately. She cursed softly and brought her hand to her mouth, tasting iron and salt. When she felt it, a spike of presence so acute it nearly brought her to her knees. The pull intensified 1,000-fold, transforming from gentle gravity into a rip current, an undertow that threatened to drown her. Cassius appeared in the doorway so suddenly she wondered if he'd actually been there the whole time, invisible in shadow. His eyes had changed. The careful civility had been stripped away, and what remained was purely predatory. Pupils dilated, iris gone nearly black, the elegant veneer cracking to expose the beast underneath. He was breathing hard, and his hands were clenched into fists that trembled with visible effort. How badly? His voice was different now, raw, dangerous, barely controlled. It's nothing. Just a... Isolde began, but he moved toward her with inhuman speed, stopping just short of contact, his entire body vibrating with restraint. Don't move, he commanded. Don't speak. Don't make this harder than it already is. She could smell his hunger now, not unpleasant, but overwhelming. It filled the room like a living thing. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something close to curiosity, a reckless desire to see what he was capable of, to understand the monster beneath the gentleman. What if I wanted you to? She whispered. His eyes snapped to hers. You don't know what you're asking. Then teach me. He made a sound somewhere between a growl and a prayer. For a long moment, he simply stood there, muscles locked, clearly warring with himself. Then, slowly, he extended his hand not toward her wound, but toward her face. His fingers were ice cold as they traced her cheekbone, her jawline, coming to rest against her neck, where her pulse hammered beneath paper-thin skin. If I do this, he said softly. If I taste your blood, even a single drop, the bond between us will deepen. It won't be a simple inheritance anymore. It will be a claiming. Do you understand? My mother understood, Isolde said, and she came back every night. Your mother was wise enough not to let me feed from her. Then teach me to be foolish. He exhaled against her throat, and she felt his fangs descend fully, not grotesque, but beautiful in their terrible precision. The cold tip of one fang touched her skin, and she felt a sensation like lightning, like every nerve ending in her body suddenly becoming aware of its own existence. Then he bit. It wasn't pain, or rather, it was pain transformed into something else entirely. The initial puncture felt like a key turning in a lock, and then there was sensation flooding through her in waves. Not just physical sensation, but knowledge. She was drowning in him in centuries of memory, in the taste of empires, in the ache of watching civilizations rise and fall, while he remained unchanged, unchanging, eternal. She saw his sister's face, saw her die in childbirth, the healer's hands shaking as she delivered the news. She felt his refusal to damn her to immortality, his choice to let her go. She experienced the witch's curse, as he experienced it, the cold spreading through his veins, the realization that he would be bound to this manor, bound to loneliness, bound to an eternity of hunger for connection he could never truly have. And she felt his longing. God, his longing. 300 years of desire to be known, to be recognized, to touch another consciousness as thoroughly as he was touching hers. The pull that had seemed seductive from her side was revealed, in his memories, as desperation bordering on madness. He pulled away suddenly, gasping, her blood staining his lips. His hands were shaking as he wiped them on his sweater. What did you... Isolde began, but the world was tilting around her. Her hand felt lighter than air. She became aware, distantly, that she was sinking toward the ground. And then Cassius was catching her, his cold arms bracketing her waist, holding her against his chest where no heartbeat sounded, where only the endless silence of the undead remained. Shh, he whispered into her hair. Don't fight it. Let it happen. You're going to sleep now, and when you wake, you'll understand. Understand what? She murmured, already half gone. That you were always meant to come back to this manor. That your bloodline was written in stone the moment the witch cursed me. That you are not my inheritance, Isolde Ashworth. You are my redemption. Darkness took her then, and in that darkness, she dreamed in blood. She woke in darkness, not the darkness of night, but the darkness of a sealed chamber, stone walls, no windows, only a single candle burning on a table beside the bed where she lay. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. Then she felt it. The gentle pressure of his presence, waiting just beyond the door, a consciousness hovering at the edges of her awareness, like a hand held just short of touching. Isolde's fingers trembled as she examined herself. She wore a nightgown cream linen, impossibly soft, smelling of lavender and something ancient. Her left hand was bandaged, the wound sealed beneath gauze that was already turning brown with dried blood. She pressed experimentally against the bandage and felt only dull ache, not pain, healing, already healing. She found a mirror on the dresser. Her reflection stared back pale, but no more pale than usual. The bite mark on her neck was covered by the high collar of the nightgown, but she could feel it beneath the fabric. 2 small punctures, already closing, leaving no mark except the faintest pink shadow. In another day, there would be nothing, no proof that she'd been touched at all, but the blood memories remained. They clung to her consciousness like smoke, like dreams that refused to dissipate with waking. She could recall Cassius's sister, Eleanor. Her name had been Eleanor with crystalline clarity, could see the expression on her face when the midwife delivered the news that the child had been stillborn, could feel the moment when Eleanor reached out to him and asked, begged, please turn me so I don't have to face eternity alone. And the moment when he refused. There was a door to the chamber, and when Isolde tried it, it opened easily. No lock. She hadn't been imprisoned, merely contained, protected during the vulnerable hours of healing. The corridor beyond was dimly lit by candelabras, and she followed them as though they were breadcrumbs through a fairy tale, descending through the manor until she found herself in the library. Cassius was waiting in the inner chamber, seated at an ancient writing desk, reviewing manuscripts by candlelight. He looked up as she entered, and she saw relief flood his features, genuine, unguarded relief, as though he'd been afraid she might not return. How do you feel? He asked. Like I've lived 2 lives at once, Isolde replied. She moved toward him slowly, drawn by the pull but also by genuine curiosity. Your memories, they're still in my blood. I can see Eleanor's face. I can feel what you felt when she died. Blood memory, Cassius said. A gift and a curse of the bloodline. When I feed from someone of my own line, they briefly access my consciousness. The effect fades over time, but the echoes remain. He paused. Your mother experienced it differently. She had only distant images, fragmentary emotions. But your connection to the bloodline is stronger. Purer, perhaps. Isolde settled into the chair across from him, studying his face in the candlelight. Now that she'd tasted his blood, she could see the architecture of his immortality more clearly, the inhuman precision of his features, the way his eyes reflected light like an animal's, beautiful and alien simultaneously. Tell me about the curse, she said. The real curse. Not what I saw through blood memory, but what you experienced. Cassius set down his quill and leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he began to speak, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. I was born in 1621 inches Cluj-Napoca, the youngest son of a merchant prince. My father ruled a small empire of trade routes and political intrigue. My sister Eleanor was born in 1625, beautiful, brilliant, utterly beloved by everyone who knew her. I was meant to expand the family's reach. She was meant to make a dynastic marriage. He paused. We were meant to grow old together and die, as mortals do. He rose and moved to a painting hung on the library's interior wall, a portrait of 2 young people, a boy and girl with the same dark eyes, the same aristocratic bearing. They were dressed in 17th century finery, and their faces held the particular arrogance of youth that believed death was something that happened to other people. In 1643, I was attacked by a vampire. Not at first, drained nearly to death, and left in the street to perish. A healer found me and brought me to her home, and over the course of 3 weeks, something changed in my blood. I woke one night with fangs and the need to feed consuming my entire being. He turned back to her. I could have attacked Eleanor. The hunger would have made it easy, made it natural. Instead, I fled. I spent decades away from Carpathia, learning to control the bloodlust, learning what I had become. By the time I returned, Eleanor was already dying. His voice cracked infinitesimally. Childbirth fever, the child stillborn, the physicians useless. And she asked me, with her last breath, to make her immortal so she could continue loving her family, continue being part of their lives. And you refused, Isolde said softly. I refused, Cassius confirmed, because to turn her would have been to damn her, to condemn her to centuries of watching everyone she loved age and die while she remained unchanged, to curse her to an existence of hunger and isolation and the slow realization that immortality is not a gift, it's a sentence. He moved back to the desk and picked up a leather journal, ancient and worn. She died that night, and 3 days later, a woman came to my manor, a Romani woman who had been Eleanor's midwife, and who claimed that my refusal to save my sister had violated a sacred law. She was a witch, a genuine one, not a charlatan, and she placed a curse on me. He opened the journal to a marked page, written in a language Isolde didn't recognize. But as she looked at it, the blood memory in her veins translated the words, "For refusing to damn when damning was love, you shall be bound to those who come after, bound to the manor that holds your shame, bound to watch generations of mortals inherit your prison, and bound forever to hunger for the connection you denied your sister." The bloodline shall be your torment and your only salvation, for only through their presence can you remember what it means to be human. Only through their blood can you briefly experience the connection you chose to deny. How many? Isolde asked. How many of my bloodline have lived in this manor since then? 17, Cassius said. Across nearly 3 centuries. Some stayed for years, some for only months. Your grandmother was the longest, 43 years. She understood the curse better than any of them. She understood that proximity to me was both necessary and dangerous, and she built her life around maintaining that impossible balance. And my mother? Isolde's voice was small. Your mother came to understand that the only way to survive the pull was to distance herself. She stayed long enough to conceive you, long enough to ensure the bloodline would continue. And then she retreated to Surrey and lived a life that was carefully, deliberately small. She told me once that you were her way of honoring both the curse and her own survival. Isolde felt something crystallize in her chest, understanding, grief, and a terrible kind of love for her mother, who had sacrificed so much to protect her daughter from a fate she hadn't even known was coming. So what happens now? She asked. Cassius moved closer, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level. Now you choose. You can do what your mother did, stay for a time, then leave, live a normal life, and let someone else in the bloodline carry the burden after you. The curse will remain, but manageable, survivable. He extended his hand. Or you can stay. You can learn what your blood is truly capable of. You can let me show you the depths of connection that the curse allows, even if those depths are bounded by my immortality and your mortality. And if I ask to become immortal? The words came out before she could stop them. Something shifted in his expression, a lightning-bright flash of desire, quickly suppressed. Then you become damned, like me, and you condemn yourself to centuries of watching the world change while you remain unchanged. I will not do to you what I refused to do to my sister. I cannot. Isolde looked at his extended hand, understanding finally what her mother had understood. The curse wasn't a simple thing. It was a trap disguised as salvation. A love so deep and so terrible that it could never be fully reciprocated without causing damnation. She took his hand anyway. The masquerade ball was Cassius's idea. You've seen me only in shadow and candlelight, he'd said 3 nights ago, as they lay on opposite sides of a velvet settee in the library, careful not to touch. You've tasted my blood and accessed my memories. But you haven't truly seen me, not as I am when the hunger is at its peak, when the beast rises and the gentleman retreats. Perhaps you should. Isolde had understood what he was offering. Not a seduction, but a revelation. A chance to witness the full scope of what he was capable of, so she could make an informed decision about whether she wanted to remain in his orbit. It was simultaneously generous and cruel mercy and manipulation wearing the same face. The ball was held in the Manor's grand ballroom, a space Isolde hadn't known existed until Cassius led her through a concealed door in the western wing. The room was vast, a cathedral of gilt and crystal, with a ceiling painted to depict a night sky so realistic it seemed the stars might fall. Chandeliers hung like captured moons, and the air smelled of jasmine and something darker, something like damp earth and old stone. There were no other guests, just Isolde, dressed in a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to absorb light, and Cassius, transformed. Gone was the civilized vampire who quoted poetry and kept careful distance. In his place stood something far more primal, his black evening wear somehow sharper, more predatory, tailored to a body that moved with explicit, dangerous grace. His eyes held that black hunger she'd glimpsed when she cut her hand, but now he made no attempt to conceal it. He let her see the full weight of 3 centuries of accumulated desire, loneliness, and bloodlust, all focused with laser precision on her. Dance with me, he said. It wasn't a request. The waltz began without visible musicians, perhaps from a phonograph hidden behind the wainscoting, perhaps from magic, perhaps from her own increasingly uncertain grip on what was real. Cassius pulled her close, one cold hand splayed against her back, the other enclosing her fingers with careful control. He danced like he lived, with inhuman grace, each movement precise and purposeful. This is what I am, he whispered against her temple. When the hunger is awake, when I remember that I am a predator, not a man. You're still a man, Isolde replied, though she could feel the danger radiating from him like heat from a forge. No. He spun her with such force that the room blurred, the chandeliers becoming streaks of light. A man has choices. A man can choose to refuse. I chose to refuse my sister, and the curse made certain I would never have that choice again. Every moment in your presence, I must choose not to take what I want. Every second, I must choose not to transform you into something like myself." They danced past a wall of mirrors, and in the glass, Isolde caught their reflection, she pale and mortal, he luminous and undead, moving together like two halves of something broken. She looked away. "Show me," she said. "Show me what happens if you don't choose." The music stopped. Cassius pulled back, his expression dark with warning. "You don't want that. How do you know what I want?" Isolde stepped closer, deliberately provocative. "You've been deciding what's best for me since I arrived. My mother let you make those decisions. I won't." Something flickered in his eyes, respect. Perhaps, or the recognition of a challenge he couldn't refuse. He took her hand and led her out of the ballroom, through corridors she didn't recognize, downstairs that spiraled into the manor's depths. They descended beyond the library, beyond the sealed chambers, into a part of Thornwick that felt genuinely ancient stone, so old it seemed to predate civilization. The chamber at the bottom was enormous. Catacombs, Isolde realized. The manor had been built atop a far older structure. The walls were lined with stone coffins, with alcoves containing bones, with evidence of centuries of burials, and in the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, stained dark. "This is where the curse binds me," Cassius said. His voice echoed strangely in the enclosed space. "This is where I feed when the hunger becomes unbearable, where I bring the hunters and the desperate, the ones who venture too close to the manor at night." He released her hand and moved to a far wall, where iron manacles hung, and beneath them, the stone was stained nearly black. "I bring them here, and I feed, and I take what I need to survive, and then I compel them to forget, to believe they were attacked by wolves, by bandits, by anything but the creature living in their manor." "How many?" Isolde whispered. "Hundreds, over 3 centuries. The hunters who came to destroy me, the vagrants seeking shelter, the curious locals who ventured too close to the grounds." He turned to face her, and his eyes were completely black now, pupil and iris indistinguishable. "And I am lying to myself if I pretend that I don't enjoy it, that there isn't a part of me that hungers for the power, the control, the ability to feed my nature without consequences." He moved toward her slowly, deliberately. "This is what I am, Isolde. Not the gentleman in the library, not the grieving brother, not the lonely prince. This, the monster, the predator, the thing that will eventually break the promises I'm making to you, because 300 years is a very long time to deny hunger." Isolde's heartbeat had accelerated. Fear and desire were indistinguishable now, mixing in her veins like wine and blood. "And if I asked you to feed on me? Really feed. Not just a taste, but then I would refuse." His voice was absolute. "Because the moment I truly feed, the moment I take enough to genuinely sustain myself from your blood, I cross a threshold I cannot uncross. The bond between us would transform. You would become not my bloodline but my thrall. Your will would begin to subvert to mine. Your choices would become mine. The very thing I've preserved in you, your autonomy, your capacity for genuine choice, would dissolve." He reached out and traced her jawline with one cold finger. "And I refuse to damn you, not because I'm noble, but because the curse requires it. Because the only way the curse can ever be broken is if someone of my bloodline chooses to stay with me, not out of compulsion, but out of genuine love. Not because they're bound by my hunger, but because they choose me anyway." "Can the curse be broken?" Isolde asked. "The witch said it could be," Cassius replied. "But only if someone loved me enough to accept immortality of their own accord. Only if they asked for the transformation knowing exactly what they were sacrificing. Only if they chose damnation freely, for love rather than hunger." He pulled his hand away. "That is the true cruelty of the curse. It makes genuine love impossible. Because any love born in my presence is poisoned by the pull, by the blood hunger, by the supernatural compulsion we cannot escape. So I remain bound, and my bloodline remains trapped, and love remains forever out of reach." Isolde understood then why her mother had left. Why every woman in her bloodline had eventually fled. Because staying meant existing in a state of beautiful, terrible torture, loving something incapable of genuine reciprocation, bound by magic rather than choice. She looked around the catacombs at the evidence of 3 centuries of survival, at the stone altar stained with the blood of countless strangers, at the immortal creature before her who had sacrificed his humanity to keep from damaging his sister's ghost. And she made a choice. "Take me back to the ballroom," she said, "and teach me to dance with the monster." The hunters came on the new moon. Isolde learned of it through Cassius. who woke her in the pre-dawn darkness with an urgency she'd never felt from him before. His presence in her mind was sharp, almost painful, an intrusion that bypassed her conscious defenses and spoke directly to her nervous system in a language of pure warning. They're here. The Order of the Silver Cross. They've been tracking me for weeks. She dressed in darkness and followed him through the manor's hidden passages, routes she'd never known existed, spiraling corridors that seemed to shift beneath her feet. They emerged in the East Tower, and Cassius barred the door with a piece of furniture heavy enough to require both their efforts. How many? Isolde asked. 7, maybe 8. They've set wards around the manor, iron, and salt, and blessed water. They're attempting to trap me inside. He moved to the window and gestured for her to stay back. Below, in the pre-dawn gloom, Isolde could make out figures moving through the gardens, carrying crosses and what looked like guns. They believe I'm weakened. They believe the inheritance bloodline makes me vulnerable. Are you? Yes. He didn't look at her. The pull toward you makes me careless, makes me less vigilant. A vampire alone might have sensed their approach days ago. A vampire in love, he caught himself, but the word hung between them anyway. Love. The attack began at sunrise. They came through the windows of the eastern wing in a coordinated assault, silver-tipped arrows, holy water in glass bottles, and blessed bullets that would do more damage to Cassius than any ordinary ammunition. Isolde heard the crash of breaking glass from 3 stories below, and felt Cassius's panic spike through the connection between them. Stay here, he commanded. And before she could protest, he was gone, moving with inhuman speed toward the sounds of violence. She didn't stay. Isolde found a fire escape and descended toward the chaos, her rational mind screaming that this was suicide, her blood screaming that she couldn't leave him to face this alone. By the time she reached the 2nd floor, the manor was filled with the smell of ozone and burning, blessed water hissing against stone, silver arrows embedding themselves in wooden frames. She found Cassius in the portrait gallery. He was cornered by 3 hunters, a tall man with a shaved head and scarred face, a woman with gray streaking her dark hair, and a younger man who couldn't have been more than 20. All 3 were trained, moving with the precision of religious warriors. Cassius was wounded, a silver arrow protruding from his left shoulder, his shirt torn and stained dark. But he was still dangerous, moving with predatory grace despite the injury, his fangs fully extended, his eyes that absolute black that meant he'd surrendered to the beast. The bloodline girl, the scarred man said, his accent Eastern European. She'll make a fine hostage. Or a fine sacrifice. Something ignited in Isolde's chest, not fear, but rage. Pure, crystalline fury that her body was too mortal to fully express. She looked around desperately and found what she needed. A candelabra from one of the wall sconces, heavy brass, still burning with real flame. She threw it. The candelabra struck the younger hunter square in the chest, and he shrieked as burning wax splattered across his face. In that moment of distraction, Cassius moved so fast that Isolde barely registered the motion before 3 hunters were flying backward, crashing into the walls with bone-breaking force. But the scarred man recovered quickly, raising a gun not loaded with bullets, but with a syringe of something cloudy and viscous. Blessed silver mixed with holy water, he said, injected directly into the bloodstream. It will incapacitate you long enough for us to finish what we started. Cassius braced himself, and Isolde realized with horror that he was resigned, that he believed this might be it, that centuries of survival might end here, in the portrait gallery, where his own face stared down at him from the walls. She moved without thinking. Isolde stepped in front of him, placing herself between the gun and his chest. The hunter hesitated just for a second, but a second was enough. Cassius grabbed her, pulling her backward and to the side, and the syringe meant for his heart embedded itself in the marble wall behind where she'd been standing. What were you thinking? He snarled, but his fear was louder than his anger. She could feel it radiating from him in waves. The scarred man was already reloading. Another dose, a stronger one, and the girl dies either way, either from proximity to the blessed silver, or from being in the presence of a vampire when it takes effect. But before he could fire, Isolde felt something shift in the manor itself, a change in the air pressure, a sound like distant thunder. The walls seemed to shudder. And then, from every portrait in the gallery, light began to emanate. The paintings of Cassius, all the previous incarnations, going back centuries, began to glow with an otherworldly luminescence. Their eyes opened, their mouths opened, and from each portrait emerged a shape not quite solid, not quite shadow, but something in between. Ghosts, or memories, or something that the blood magic binding Cassius to the manor had shaped into a weapon. The hunters screamed. Isolde watched as the spectral forms surrounded them, not attacking, but pressing, bearing down with the weight of 300 years of accumulated rage and sorrow. The scarred man collapsed to his knees, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. The woman was crying, backing toward the windows. The younger hunter was already running, his screams echoing through the manor. Within minutes, the intrusion was over. The hunters were fleeing through the grounds, and the spectral forms were dissolving back into the portraits, their eyes closing, their mouths shutting, the glow fading back into oil paint and varnish. Cassius sank to his knees, the silver arrow still protruding from his shoulder. Isolde knelt beside him, and carefully, gently, extracted it. Black blood welled from the wound, and she found herself pressing her palm against it, as though her mortal touch might somehow slow the bleeding. "Thank you," he whispered, "for stepping in front of me. Don't," Isolde interrupted. "Don't thank me for something I'd do again without hesitation." He looked at her then, and there was something different in his expression, something like acceptance, like surrender. "The manor defended me. The curse showed me that it still binds me, still has power. Do you understand what that means?" "No," Isolde said. "It means the curse hasn't weakened. It means your bloodline is still strong, still connected to the magic that traps me here. It means..." He paused, his hand reaching up to cup her face. "It means that if you asked me to turn you, to make you immortal, the curse would allow it. The magic would recognize it as a choice made by my bloodline, and it would accept the transformation." Isolde felt her heartbeat accelerate. "Would it break the curse?" "I don't know," Cassius said. The witch was unclear. She said only that genuine choice, made freely and with full knowledge of the cost, might break the binding. "But I can't ask you to sacrifice your mortality on the basis of might." From outside, they could hear the sound of the hunters' vehicles disappearing down the drive. The manor settled around them, the tension easing, the supernatural weight lifting. "We have time," Isolde said, though she wondered if that was true. "We have time to understand this better." But as she helped Cassius to his feet, she could feel something shifting in the foundations of her certainty. The curse had shown its hand today. It had protected him, which meant it was invested in his survival, his continuation, and that meant, eventually, it would demand payment. The only question was whether she was willing to pay it. End. Chapter 7. Ready for Chapter 8. Blood and desire converge? The fever came 3 days after the hunter's attack. Isolde woke burning, her skin on fire, her thoughts fragmented into pieces that wouldn't cohere. She stumbled from her room seeking water, seeking cool air, seeking anything that might quell the inferno that had taken residence in her blood. The blessed silver from the syringe she understood now. It had grazed her somehow during the assault, a scratch she hadn't noticed, a micro-wound that had let the contamination seep into her veins. Cassius found her collapsed on the library stairs, delirious and dying. She registered him only distantly, a presence of cold that should have been welcome but instead felt like ice against a burn, painful in its contradictions. He was speaking, his voice urgent, but the words reached her through layers of static and fever dream. "Poisoning you. The blessed silver is in your blood, and it's burning through your system like acid." "Cold," Isolde murmured. "Make it cold." He carried her to the catacombs, to the stone chamber with the altar. Not to feed, she understood dimly, but to immerse her in the oldest magic the manor possessed. He laid her on the altar itself, the very stone that had been stained with centuries of blood, and she felt the magic rise beneath her like a tide, drawn from the earth itself, ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. Hours passed, or days. Time became meaningless in the fever. She was dying, she understood. The blessed silver was incompatible with her mortal blood, and Cassius, with all his centuries and power, was unable to stop it. He could only watch as she burned, as her mortality became a liability rather than an asset, as the inheritance that connected them became the very thing that would kill her. She heard him weeping, an immortal creature weeping like his heart was breaking. "I can stop this," he said, his voice raw. "I can stop it now, before it takes you." Isolde's eyes were too heavy to open, but she understood what he was offering. The transformation, the bite that would save her life by ending it, replacing her mortal existence with immortal damnation. "No," she whispered through lips that tasted like ash and copper. "No, that's not you," said. "I lied," Cassius said savagely. "I lied when I said I could refuse. I lied when I said genuine love was impossible. I lied about everything except this. I cannot watch you die. I will not watch you die, and if the curse wants to damn me for breaking my promise, then let it damn me. She felt his fangs against her throat, not a gentle introduction, but desperate, hungry, the bite of a creature who had finally surrendered to the beast inside. But instead of feeding, he was giving. She felt it, his blood, ancient and powerful, flowing into her veins, burning away the poison of the blessed silver, replacing her dying cells with something new, something that would last forever. Isolde's scream echoed through the catacombs as her body transformed. Bones restructured themselves. Her heart changed rhythm, learning a new pattern that would sustain her across centuries. The fever became something else, not burning, but awakening. Every nerve ending, suddenly aware of its own existence, suddenly capable of sensations she'd never imagined. And then, worst and best of all, she could feel him. Every memory, every moment, every century he'd lived. She was drowning in Cassius, and she didn't want to surface. She saw Eleanor again, but not through blood memory, through his memory, living and breathing in his consciousness. She felt his grief as though it were her own, felt the weight of refusing to damn his sister, felt the moment the witch's curse settled on him like chains. She experienced centuries of isolation, each year bleeding into the next, centuries of hunger that had nothing to do with blood, and everything to do with the desperate need for connection. And she felt his love for her mother. Complicated, constrained, but genuine. The way her mother had learned to dance with him in the library. How they'd developed an understanding that transcended the curse's binding. How her mother had left, knowing that Isolde would eventually come. And how Cassius had counted the years, waiting, knowing his bloodline would return. I didn't want to do this, Cassius's voice said in her mind, not spoken, but transmitted directly from consciousness to consciousness. I wanted to be noble. I wanted to prove that the curse couldn't break me, couldn't turn me into the monster that fed on those he loved. But I was always a monster, Isolde replied, and her voice in his mind was clear and certain. We both were. The curse didn't create that. It just gave it form. She opened her eyes, and her vision was transformed. She could see in absolute darkness now, could perceive the thermal signatures of living things, could sense the movement of blood through veins from across a room. The catacombs around her were rendered in perfect detail, every stone sharp and clear, and she could feel Cassius's heartbeat. Even though he didn't have one, she could feel his pulse in the magic that bound them, in the blood that now flowed in her veins, identical to his own. I'm sorry, he whispered, and she realized he was kneeling beside the altar where she lay, his forehead pressed against the stone. I broke my promise. I damned you. Isolde sat up slowly, testing her new body, her new capabilities. She felt stronger than she'd ever been, inhumanly strong, immortally strong. She looked at her hands and saw that her skin had taken on a faint luminescence, like moonlight trapped beneath glass. You saved my life, she said. Her voice sounded different, deeper, with harmonics she'd never possessed before. The curse demanded that we both surrender to it, and we did. She reached out and pulled him close, and when she kissed him, she tasted blood and power, and 300 years of loneliness finally ending. His hands shook as he held her, afraid that if he let go, she might dissolve into the darkness from which they'd pulled her. What happens now? He asked against her mouth. The curse. The curse changed the moment you chose to transform me, Isolde said. She could feel it, resonating through the manor, through the very stones beneath them. The magic was shifting, recalibrating, recognizing that something fundamental had been altered. I chose immortality knowingly. I chose you knowingly. That's what the witch said would break it, isn't it? Genuine choice. They waited, suspended in the moment, as the catacombs around them began to tremble. The stone altar beneath her glowed with spectral light, the accumulated power of 3 centuries of blood magic, of hunger and loneliness, and the desperate need for connection. It rose like a tide, like a wave, like the breaking of a dam that had held back an ocean. And then, silence. The trembling stopped. The light faded. The manor settled around them with a sound like a sigh, as though Thornwick itself had been holding its breath for 300 years, and had finally been permitted to exhale. Cassius pulled back, studying her face with an expression of wonder. It's gone. I can feel it. The curse, it's broken. Or transformed, Isolde corrected. She stood, and he helped her up, their hands intertwined. Maybe the curse wasn't meant to be broken. Maybe it was meant to be completed, to transform us into something neither of us could have been alone. They climbed the stairs together, leaving the catacombs behind. As they ascended toward the manor's heart, Isolde felt something she'd never expected to feel. Not relief, but completion. She was no longer mortal, no longer bound by the limitations of time. She was immortal, damned, yes, but damned in the company of someone who had waited 300 years for her to arrive. The sun was rising as they reached the library, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Cassius flinched away from the windows instinctively, but then hesitated. "Try it," Isolde whispered. He stepped into the sunlight, and to both their amazement, his skin didn't burn. It glowed, luminescent and beautiful, as though the curse's final gift was to make him daywalker, to free him from the night that had imprisoned him for so long. They stood together in the morning light, watching the world transform, understanding that everything had changed, and that their eternal night had finally ended. The library was different in daylight. Isolde moved through the vast chamber with the careful wonder of someone seeing a familiar space transformed. Sunlight streamed through windows that had remained shuttered for centuries, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits finally permitted to move freely. The books, thousands upon thousands of volumes, seemed to glow from within, their leather spines rich with color, their gilt lettering catching the light like captured fire. Cassius stood at the center of the room, his arms extended, experiencing sunlight directly on his skin for the first time in 300 years. His luminescence had faded somewhat with the morning's passage, but it remained visible, a faint silver sheen that marked him as something other than human. He was weeping silently, tears tracking down his pale cheeks as he turned slowly in circles, reacquainting himself with a world he'd been forced to abandon. "I'd forgotten," he whispered. "I'd forgotten what warmth felt like." Isolde joined him in the sunlight, and she understood. She could feel the change in him, the transformation not just physical but spiritual. The Daywalker curse that had replaced the original binding was a gift wrapped in redemption. He was no longer a creature of shadow. He was no longer imprisoned by darkness. But as she stood beside him, she became aware of something else. A presence moving through the manor. Something vast and ancient and deeply satisfied. The curse, or what remained of it, seemed to be settling into its new configuration, accepting the transformation, acknowledging that its purpose had been fulfilled. "Can you feel it?" she asked. "Yes." Cassius took her hand. "The magic is settling. It's as though the manor itself is breathing for the first time, as though it's been waiting for this moment as long as I have." They spent the afternoon in the library, and Isolde discovered that the transformation had given her access to something unexpected, a form of blood memory that extended beyond Cassius. She could read the books not just with her eyes, but with her new senses, could feel the history embedded in leather and paper, could sense the hands that had held each volume, could taste the knowledge absorbed into the very fibers. It was overwhelming and exhilarating simultaneously. As evening approached, Cassius led her to a chamber she hadn't entered before, a room at the manor's heart, accessed through a door that had previously appeared to be solid wall. Inside was a circular space, with a domed ceiling painted to depict the night sky in perfect astronomical accuracy. In the center stood a stone platform, and upon it, an ancient book bound in what looked disturbingly like skin. "The Covenant of Blood," Cassius said softly. "The original binding document. The witch who cursed me left it here, as proof of what had been done, and as," he paused, "as a map for breaking the curse, if ever someone was willing to pay the price." Isolde approached the book carefully. She could feel its age radiating from it like heat, could sense the power coiled within its pages. When she opened it, the text was in multiple languages: Romanian, Latin, Old English, languages she'd never studied but now could somehow read, courtesy of Cassius's blood and memory. The first passage made her blood, her now eternal blood, run cold. "To the one who breaks this binding, know that you have not destroyed the curse, but transformed it. The vampire prince remains bound to the manor, but no longer by chains of isolation. He is bound now by love, by choice, by the willing sacrifice of the bloodline. This binding is stronger than the first, for it is built on consent rather than punishment. The manor shall acknowledge this covenant. The Daywalker's curse shall mark the prince as redeemed, and the bloodline shall be immortal, walking between shadow and light, neither fully damned nor fully saved. But know this truth: the covenant can only be maintained through genuine love. Should that love ever fail, should either party ever choose to break the bond, the original curse shall return stronger than before, hungry to reclaim what it has lost. The prince shall be bound not to one manor but to the entire world, cursed to wander eternally, unable to rest, unable to feed, unable to find peace. Isolde looked up from the book to find Cassius watching her with an expression of profound vulnerability. "The curse used my own love against me," he said quietly. "It made me refuse to damn Eleanor, which meant I refused to transform her, which meant she died believing I didn't love her enough to grant her immortality. And then it bound me to a manor, and to bloodlines beyond my control, forcing me to wait centuries for someone who might or might not choose to stay." He moved closer, taking the book from her hands and closing it gently. "But now the curse has become something different. It binds us together, not through supernatural compulsion, but through actual choice. The magic recognizes that you chose transformation knowingly. The magic recognizes that I chose you over my centuries of isolation." "What are you asking?" Isolde said, though she already knew. "I'm asking if you can forgive me for damning you," Cassius said. "I'm asking if you can stay with me, not because you're bound by curse or blood, but because you genuinely want to. I'm asking if the love you feel for me is real, or if it's just an echo of my love for you, transmitted through the transformation." Isolde felt something crystallize in her chest, not certainty exactly, but something close. She'd been transformed against her will, yes. But she'd also been given the choice to refuse. And she hadn't. She'd chosen him. She'd chosen immortality. She'd chosen to bind herself to both Cassius and Thornwick Manor for eternity. "I love you," she said simply. "Not because the curse demands it, not because my blood compels it, because you are the saddest, most beautiful, most broken thing I've ever encountered. And you loved my mother, and you waited for me, and you were willing to sacrifice your noble refusal to save my life." She stepped closer, and when she kissed him, it was with the weight of genuine choice behind it, not the compulsion of the curse, but the deliberate decision of one immortal to bind herself to another. "I covenant with you," she whispered against his lips. "Not because magic demands it, because I choose it." Cassius held her so tightly she could feel the tremor running through his body. Relief, joy, the weight of 300 years finally being lifted. Around them, the manor seemed to shimmer, as though acknowledging the covenant, as though welcoming the transformation of curse into promise. When they emerged from the chamber, night had fallen completely. But Cassius didn't retreat to shadows as he once would have. Instead, he led her to the manor's highest tower, and they stood together watching the moon rise full and luminous, painting the world in silver light. "What happens now?" Isolde asked. "Now," Cassius said, pulling her close. "We live. For as long as immortality permits, we live together. We love each other. We tend this manor that has been both our prison and our salvation, and we wait to see if the curse was truly broken, or if it was simply transformed into something we can bear together." He kissed her forehead, her temple, finally her lips. "I love you, Isolde Ashworth. Not because you're my bloodline, not because you're bound to this manor, but because you chose to be. That choice is everything." Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding below. But Isolde felt, in that moment, that they were witnessing something significant, the breaking and remaking of an ancient curse, the transformation of damnation into redemption. The night was no longer a prison. It was a home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, delivered by a courier who refused to enter the manor and departed immediately after handing it to Cassius. The envelope was cream-colored and expensive, sealed with wax that bore a symbol Isolde didn't recognize, a silver cross wrapped in thorns. "The Order of the Silver Cross," Cassius said, his voice tight. "They don't typically communicate by post." Inside was a formal declaration of war, written in elegant script by someone educated and dangerous. "To Cassius Venn, cursed prince of Carpathia, daywalker abomination, we have observed your recent transformation with great interest. The blessed silver that should have destroyed you instead elevated you, marking you as either a mercy of God or a deception of the devil. We have chosen to believe the latter. Your bloodline girl has become immortal through your influence. This is not merely a violation of natural law, it is an act of spiritual desecration. We have gathered our hunters from across Europe. We will come to Thornwick Manor on the night of the blood moon, and we will end both you and the cursed thing you have made of her. The Order." Isolde set the letter down with trembling hands. "How many hunters does the Order have?" "Hundreds," Cassius said quietly. "Organized, trained, blessed by the church itself. The 3 who came before were merely scouts." He moved to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "They're right about one thing. Your transformation is unprecedented. The Order has records going back centuries, and they've never encountered a vampire created by choice, bound by covenant rather than hunger. "Can we leave?" Isolde asked, though she already knew the answer. The manor was bound to them now, and they to it. Thornwick Manor was no longer a prison, but it was still a cage, albeit one they'd chosen to enter. "No," Cassius confirmed. "The covenant binds us here. If we leave, the curse returns. If the curse returns, we're hunted eternally," Isolde finished. She'd read the Covenant of Blood thoroughly enough to understand the mechanics of their binding. The blood moon rose 3 weeks later, swollen and red, painting the world in the color of fresh wounds. Isolde stood on the manor's highest tower with Cassius, watching the perimeter of the grounds as the order assembled. They came in waves, hunters in groups of 10 and 12, bearing crosses and blessed weapons, setting up siege positions at every approach to the manor. 47, Isolde counted, maybe more in the darkness. "The church sent their best," Cassius said grimly. "They want to make an example of us. They want to prove that even a transformed curse cannot survive their faith." Unlike the first attack, this one was methodical and coordinated. The hunters didn't rush. Instead, they began a siege surrounding the manor completely, cutting off every exit, establishing positions where they could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. They chanted prayers in Latin, and Isolde felt the blessed magic they were weaving begin to suffocate the manor itself, pressing down like a physical weight. "The wards are strengthening," Cassius said. "They're trying to trap us inside, prevent me from manifesting the manor's defenses." Inside, the portraits began to glow, the spectral forms of previous Cassiuses preparing to defend their current incarnation. But there was a difference this time. The hunters had learned from the last attack. They'd brought artifacts of such profound holiness that the spectral forms couldn't fully manifest. They were weakened, constrained, unable to break through the blessed barriers the order was establishing. The first wave of hunters attacked at midnight. They came through the windows with coordinated precision, blessed fire and silver-tipped arrows following in their wake. Cassius transformed, his daywalker form giving way to something more primal, fangs fully extended, claws manifesting. The predator finally released from all constraints. He moved through the hunters like a force of nature. But even his immortal strength couldn't overcome the blessed weapons they wielded. Silver burned him. Holy water left marks that wouldn't heal. Prayers seemed to weaken him, as though centuries of faith could physically diminish his power. Isolde fought beside him, discovering that her transformation had given her capabilities she'd barely begun to explore. She was fast enough to intercept arrows mid-flight. She was strong enough to disarm hunters and throw them from windows. But she was also, she realized with horror, subject to the same blessed weapons that damaged Cassius. A silver blade caught her arm, and she felt the distinctive burn of sanctified metal searing her immortal flesh. The manor shook under the assault. Chandeliers crashed to the floor. Portraits fell from walls. The very stones seemed to cry out in pain. "We can't hold them," Isolde gasped, blood, her eternal blood running down her arm. "No," Cassius agreed. His voice was different now, split somehow, as though multiple versions of himself were speaking simultaneously. The spectral forms of the previous Cassiuses were merging with his consciousness, lending him their accumulated centuries of knowledge and power. But the manor can. The curse can. The covenant can. He pulled her toward the center of the manor, toward the chamber where the covenant of blood remained. The hunters were pursuing, their blessed weapons cutting through the stone corridors, their prayers shaking the foundations of Thornwick. Inside the covenant chamber, Cassius drew her to the central platform. The book said the covenant could only be maintained through genuine love, but it also said that love could be reinforced through sacrifice. "What are you suggesting?" Isolde asked, though she could feel the answer resonating through the very stones around them. "A blood renewal," Cassius said. "A moment where we both return to the source of the curse and reinforce our choice. It will strengthen the binding, will give the manor the power to defend itself more completely. But it will require our blood," Isolde finished. She understood now what needed to happen. She understood what her mother had understood centuries ago, that the curse would always demand a price, that immortality would never be free. The hunters burst through the door, just as Cassius raised the Covenant of Blood book. He opened it to a page written in neither of the languages Isolde had encountered before, a language older than words, older than human civilization. And when he began to read, the very air seemed to split. Blood rose from the stone beneath them. Not their blood, but the accumulated blood of 300 years. The blood of hunters and vagrants and desperate creatures. All the lives Cassius had fed upon. All the sacrifices the curse had demanded. It rose like a tide. like a tide that had been waiting centuries to be released. The Order's hunters screamed as the blood surrounded them, as the curse transformed but not destroyed turned its full power upon those who would break the covenant. The blessed weapons fell from nerveless fingers, the prayers caught in their throats, and Cassius, holding Isolde close, whispered words in that ancient language, renewing the binding, reinforcing the covenant, acknowledging that their love was not a weakness but a strength, the only thing powerful enough to balance the curse they now wielded together. The blood tide receded. The hunters were gone, either dead or fled. Isolde couldn't tell, but Thornwick Manor remained, standing firm against the assault, protected by the very curse that had bound it for so long. In the silence that followed, Isolde realized the final truth. The curse had never been meant to be broken. It had been meant to evolve. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over Thornwick Manor. The siege had ended, though Isolde wasn't certain whether the Order's hunters had been killed or had simply fled in terror. Either way, they were gone. No bodies remained. No evidence of their assault except for the scarred stone walls and the shattered windows that Cassius was methodically repairing by hand, as though the physical act of restoration could somehow undo what had been broken. Isolde found him in the eastern wing, running his fingers along a bullet hole in the marble walls. He'd stopped wearing the veneer of human civility entirely now. His transformation had completed itself. His skin carried a permanent luminescence. His eyes had taken on a silver sheen that marked him clearly as something other than mortal, and his movements held an economy of grace that suggested he'd finally made peace with what he was. "The Order will return," he said without turning. "Not soon, perhaps, but eventually. The Church doesn't forgive. They'll gather more hunters, more blessed weapons, more faith. They'll keep coming until either we're destroyed or they are. Then we'll defend ourselves," Isolde replied. She'd changed too. Her appearance had stabilized into something that looked eternally 30 years old, but her eyes held centuries that had been compressed into weeks. The transformation had accelerated her understanding of immortality. She was beginning to experience time differently, to understand how the years might blur together into decades, how decades might blur into centuries. Cassius turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It was resignation mixed with something else, acceptance, perhaps, or understanding. "I've been thinking about what the covenant said," he began, "about genuine love being the foundation of the binding, and I realized something. We're bound by choice, yes, but we're also bound by necessity. You chose immortality to save your life. I chose to transform you to prevent your death. Those were desperate acts, not the actions of rational lovers making a deliberate choice about eternity. Are you saying you don't love me?" Isolde's voice was sharp. "No," Cassius said softly. "I'm saying I love you far too much to trap you here forever, based on decisions made in crisis. The covenant requires genuine choice, freely made, and I want to give you that choice, truly give it to you before the Order returns." He extended his hand, and in his palm lay 2 vials. One contained blood that glowed with a soft silver luminescence, his blood, transformed by the Daywalker curse. The other contained liquid that was perfectly clear, odorless, utterly innocuous in appearance. "The first vial will break the covenant," he said quietly. "It will sever the binding between us. The curse will return to its original form. I'll be bound to Thornwick Manor again, unable to leave, unable to venture into daylight, but you will be freed. You'll be able to leave, to live your immortal life beyond these walls, to discover what eternity means without the weight of this manor, this curse, this broken prince holding you down." "And the second?" Isolde asked, though she could guess. "The second is a poison," Cassius said. "Specifically formulated by the previous inhabitants of the manor. I found the recipe in the library. It will end your immortality. You'll become mortal again. You'll age. You'll eventually die. But you'll be free. You'll be able to walk in daylight without fear of hunters. You'll be able to build a normal life. A human life. The one you should have had if I hadn't damned you." Isolde stared at the vials. "And what will you do?" "I'll remain here," Cassius said. "As I have for 300 years. I'll wait for the Order's next attack. I'll defend this manor and this curse, as long as I'm capable of doing so. And I'll remember that for one brief, shining moment. Someone of my own bloodline loved me enough to sacrifice her humanity." "That's a beautiful speech," Isolde said coldly. "Very noble and tragic. But it's also a lie, and we both know it." Cassius's expression flickered with something surprise, perhaps, or recognition. The covenant doesn't just bind us through love, Isolde continued. It binds us through the manor. The magic recognized my transformation as legitimate because it was made by choice. Yes, but also because I'm bloodline. Because the manor has been waiting for someone like me for 300 years. You can't break that binding with a vial of blood. The manor won't let you. She moved closer, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of understanding that had come with her transformation. You're trying to give me a choice I don't have. You're trying to absolve yourself of responsibility for damning me by offering me an escape route that doesn't actually exist. But I don't need escape. I chose you. I chose immortality, and I chose this manor. She picked up the vials and hurled them against the wall. They shattered, spilling their contents onto the marble floor, where the silver liquid began to glow, and the clear poison began to evaporate like morning mist. The order will come again, Isolde said. And again. And perhaps eventually, they'll destroy us both. But that's the risk of covenant. That's the price of choosing something eternal in a world designed for mortality. I understand that now, and I'm not asking you to make it easier for me. I'm asking you to stop being a martyr and start being a partner. Cassius remained motionless for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. Not the careful, civilized smile he'd worn before, but something genuine and raw and utterly devastated. I don't deserve you, he whispered. No, Isolde agreed. But you have me anyway. That's what covenant means. She took his hand, and together they climbed to the manor's highest tower. The blood moon was setting in the west, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Below them, the grounds of Thornwick Manor stretched out gardens, overgrown with centuries of neglect but beautiful in their wildness. Stone walls that had stood for longer than written history, a space that had been cursed, and was now, perhaps, finally blessed. How long do you think we have? Isolde asked. Before the order returns? Months, Cassius said. Perhaps longer. They'll need to reorganize, to gather new hunters, to convince the church that their failure was temporary and not permanent. He paused. But they will return. The church has a long memory and an even longer reach. Then we prepare, Isolde said simply. We study the covenant. We explore the manor's defenses. We discover what we're truly capable of, together. And if the order comes, we stand against them, not as victim and savior, but as equals. She felt his arm tighten around her waist. I'm afraid, he admitted. Afraid that I'll lose you. Afraid that the curse is simply waiting for us to drop our guard before it devours us both. Good, Isolde said. Fear is appropriate. It means you understand what's at stake. She turned to face him, and when she kissed him, it was with the certainty of someone who had already made her choice and had no intention of wavering. The curse is part of us now, Cassius. It's not something we fight. It's something we inhabit. We live with it. We love despite it. And we build something real in the space between damnation and redemption. Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Isolde realized, with perfect clarity, that she had no desire to be human anymore, no desire to escape, no desire to be anything other than what she was. Immortal, bound to a broken prince and a cursed manor, her love neither pure nor simple, but genuine and deep and utterly inescapable. The night was falling. The curse remained, and in the centuries ahead, Isolde Ashworth and Cassius Venn would face whatever came, hunters and doubt, and the slow erosion of an immortal's soul together. It was not a happy ending, but it was an honest one. And in the architecture of Gothic romance, where love is measured in blood and sacrifice and the willingness to be damned, it was the only ending that truly mattered.